We'll start now with a presentation on economic incentives for halting this deforestation in the Amazon by Gustavo Fonseca, who is the Director of Programs at the Global Environmental Facility. And after that, Rita Mesquita will make the last presentation of the day. She's a senior researcher at the National Institutes of the Amazon Research, Impa, in Manaus, where we had a meeting similar to this at the Bosque da Ciência about 2 months ago. So, Gustavo, are you good to go?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulo. Thanks for inviting me to this interesting seminar, and I was very fortunate to get myself acquainted again with some of the latest developments on sciences and climate change science from the region through the 2 talks that I've heard. It's my pleasure to address you from the perspective of the Global Environment Facility. The title was actually given to me. It's not my title. So you have it there for illustrative purposes only. I'm not sure if you're expecting that I can tell you how to provide economic incentives to stop deforestation in the Amazon. This is not the talk that will give you that, but hopefully we can at least give you some pointers to how we are seeing this problem from the perspective of an organization that does financing for developing countries for deforestation. Paulo, you wanted to?
No, I just wanted to ask you to do something because I remember where how the Global Environmental Facility came
Yes.
about. Can you, in 2 minutes, tell them what Jeff is?
This is my second slide. Just Thank you, Paulo. All right. So the GEF, as we like to call it, the Global Environment Facility, was created in '91, actually as a pilot program of the World Bank to deal with the global commons or global public goods on the environment side that were suffering the fate of the tragedy of the commons, in which these assets of global importance were providing services, but there were no incentives to keep them as such. And then something very interesting happened, which was the Rio Summit in '92 in Brazil, in which the first 2 multilateral environmental agreements came to life: the Convention on Biodiversity and the Climate Change Convention. They were born in Rio. And the developing countries only agreed to be part of this agreement if there was some funding to allow them to fast-track their economies towards greener pathways that they couldn't otherwise do. And they wanted that money to come from the developed countries. And someone had the bright idea, oh, there's this pilot here, why don't you transform this into a fund for developing countries to finance their commitments to these agreements. That's how the GEF was born. And it was first established with an instrument of independence. Actually, we are housed administratively at the World Bank. I'm technically a World Bank employee, but I have a different boss, which is my governing body, which is made up of half developing country governments and half developed country governments. Since then, we have acquired other mandates. Now we have the financial mechanism for 5 different conventions, which makes our lives quite complicated, not only the Convention on Biological Diversity, but the Climate Change Convention, the Stockholm Convention to eliminate toxic chemicals, particularly persistent organic pollutants that have been banned by several governments, but there are still stockpiles all over the world. So we are responsible for identifying, eliminating the stockpiles that eventually get into our food chain, and it's not a happy outcome. And the Convention to Combat Desertification was also discussed during the Rio Summit, but it didn't become a convention until later on. And this is kind of the convention of the dryland countries, of the dryland ecosystems, and has a very strong focus on Africa. And last year we became the financial mechanism of the Minamata Convention to eliminate mercury from industrial processes and from artisanal and small-scale gold mining. If you recall the disaster in Minamata Bay in Japan, that's where the name comes from, and now it's this convention has been ratified and it's in operation. We have also provided funding for the Montreal Protocol over the years to combat substances that deplete the ozone layer, and also to the UN Forum on Forests. So since then, we became the largest single funder of projects and programs for the global public goods that have to do with the environment. And we operate through 18 accredited agencies. We began with World Bank, UNDP, and UNEP, or UN Environment now. And now we have 18 accredited agencies, including international NGOs such as WWF. Meg Smyton's present here from WWF. I'm going to touch upon a couple of projects that they have been playing a big role. Conservation International, but also all the regional development banks. So this is we are a partnership. We are a very small secretariat housed at the World Bank, and we serve all these conventions, and we have an independent council, an independent evaluation office, and we rely on all these 18 agencies. And then we, every 4 years, develop a strategy. We get guidance from the convention, or the parties to the conventions, and what they want us to fund developing countries for. We develop that into operational strategies, and then we go with our hat, and over a year and a half, negotiate with the donor countries to try to put money in the fund. We just completed our 7th replenishment cycle 2 months ago, and we got, for this next 4 years, $4.1 billion to spend. So that's how it operates. So the Amazon, you heard a lot in the morning, so I don't need to repeat it, is one of the major sources of ecosystem services regionally and globally. If you look at the range of services and the sheer magnitude of this biome that's shared by 8 countries, 9 if you consider the French territory of French Guyana. It's the largest tropical wilderness is still standing. It's likely the most biologically diverse forest on Earth. The world's largest freshwater system, and one of the largest storehouses of carbon, as it was shown here in the morning with the talks by Jose and by Paulo. Now we have about 610 protected areas and over 2,000 indigenous reserves. They're approaching 50% of the territory. I, being a biologist by training, I always like to talk about the biodiversity services that the Amazon provides and the biodiversity wealth that the region has. These are assessments of biological importance of different regions. As we can see, the Amazon is not one region, it's many, many regions. It was also highlighted in Marengo's presentation this morning in terms of the diversity of climatic regimens, soils and histories, etc. And so we need to look at the system as a whole system, as opposed to just being pieces that you want to preserve for posterity, but actually there is a lot of interlinkage between what happens in one place and what happens next door or even further away. Unfortunately, biodiversity services are not yet marketable. They are not yet, they don't have price signals. The market cannot really directly act on this, and therefore we need to find other alternatives to provide financing to protect standing forests. And we heard a lot this morning also of carbon, right? Because carbon is the next best way of entry point, particularly now that we have these frameworks and these agreements. These are just some of the valuations of ecosystem services that one could derive potentially from standing forests. However, most of this is unrealized precisely because it's more profitable at the local scale in many places to convert forests than to put it to other uses. So what do we do? This is just looking at Brazil, which is going to be the focus of my presentation here this morning. Brazil became, of course, a big agribusiness operation. Across the board, we like to talk about soy and about cattle, but agriculture has taken a toll in other areas of Brazil, historically in the Atlantic forest, actually where I started my own work, where 85% was eliminated. And now we have the Cerrado being the next target. The Amazon is somewhat under control, but as controls increase in the Amazon, more activity gets leaked into the Cerrado region, and that is causing also severe problems. So this is, again, the dynamic and the trajectory that takes place when you have public goods that are not marketable. But we have now the Paris Agreement, which guides what we do in terms of funding. And we also have Brazil's nationally determined contribution, in which forests and land use play a significant role. 46% of the Brazil's emissions come from land use change and from forestry. And there are several commitments included in the NDCs which form the basis for what we provide and will provide funding over the years, including reducing deforestation, but also restoring degraded lands, restoring pasture lands that can be brought back to production so that you don't have to continue carving out new agricultural territory out of standing forests. And upon this mandate, we can be very active. So this also can be reflected on, let's say, the cost effectiveness of funding that can be provided. There's a study that McKinsey did on how Brazil could achieve most effective emission reductions. And of course, it's again on the land use side and on the forestry side that can achieve close to 60 or 70% of the abatement that Brazil needs to have. It's been estimated that abating forestry-led greenhouse gas emissions in Brazil would be about $2 billion a year over the next 20 years. And if the figure may be twice as that, if we also need to include in this calculation what needs to happen at the very local level in terms of socioeconomic development for populations that are affected by deforestation or that depend on forest services. And this is just a cost estimate of $6.50 per ton of CO2 that generated these numbers. We are now looking at, under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that we can start looking at carbon pricing and start looking at market solutions for that. And I would like to say that market solutions are an important piece of this. It doesn't resolve everything, but you can start working on this. There have been some initial studies and simulations and models that companies have come together to look at. If Brazil, for example, decides to take on an emission trading scheme, and also other developing countries such as India have done similar analysis, you could develop a very robust market that could generate significant amounts that could revert back to forest management and conservation. But how are we doing? I mentioned $2 billion or $4 billion. How much money is going to the Amazon? And this is a study that was done by the Moore Foundation and by the Conservation Strategy Fund. And as you can see on this bar here, most of the money that's going into Amazon for a variety of objectives come from multilateral donors, bilateral donors, some private foundations and NGOs. And it's about, the last 3 years, about $1 billion. So out of a need of perhaps $2 billion to $4 billion, we have about $300 million going into the region, which of course represents much less than we would need if we were to use those calculations as the basis for financing for Amazon management and conservation. So what economic incentives can have been tried? I guess you all know about the Amazon Fund that was established in 2008, primarily driven by the Norway bilateral funding that deals with forests and climate change, and that came to be administered by the National Development Bank of Brazil, BNDES, And it's a performance-based fund in which you have a baseline of deforestation. You've seen this in the morning. And out of a projection of how much is expected to be deforested against mitigation measures, you could have a payment that's calculated, again, on price of carbon. And then this would revert back to work on management of protected areas, enforcement of legislation and provisions, creating economic activities out of the forest, and so forth. So Brazil signed this agreement with Norway in 2008 for a 5-year period, and $1 billion were pledged originally, and Norway paid 113 million up to 2016, and then because it's a performance-based mechanism, it decreased its payment when deforestation picked up again, or not picked, but experienced some increase in 2016. Some attribute that to the new forest code. It's debatable, but that's what happened. And in December of 2013, the government decided to expand this agreement until 2021 against, again, performance-based results. Norway remains the largest donor to the Amazon Fund, but Germany and also some national money has gone into it as well. So how can we find these additional incentives? Again, I mentioned that carbon price will expect it to be increasing over time. You probably heard through your professional careers the promise of the carbon market, 20 years into the making. But I can tell you that this is actually picking up momentum again, and particularly as subnational entities, particularly states, start to look into this in a much more aggressive way, such as here in the US. Everybody talks about the United States government retreating from the Paris Agreement, when in fact last week we came back from the Global Climate Summit that Governor Jerry Brown of California organized, in which the entire state has tremendous momentum, including with its own state-based market for carbon. And that's happening also in Massachusetts and other places. It's happening in Europe. So that may pick it up very, very quickly. And then I would like to just pull a plug there if you want to discuss this later on. I didn't want to get into this discussion on, particularly on pharmaceuticals and phytotherapeutics and bioprospecting, because it's a very contentious discussion. Some people have been aggressively pursuing this. I believe that there is something to be gained there, and but I thought it would take too much time out of this discussion, but we can touch on this on the question and answer. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ARPA project, the Protected Areas of the Amazon project, that was the first investment that the JEF made in Brazil together with the World Wildlife Fund. And again, Meg is here. She may want to say a few words later on. And it was turned out to be the largest single project of conservation of rainforests in the world over the years. And it's extended now to protect 50 million hectares, which is equivalent to what, France, and equivalent to the size of California, twice the size of Germany. And the project very quickly identified areas that could be put into protection, both at the federal level as well as the state level. And eventually it was also expanded to cover extractive reserves and sustainable development reserves, and not only strictly protected areas. Funding was allocated to this. The JEF over the years has allocated close to $60 million to ARPA, and I'm going to show you the projections now. And from BIO, the Biodiversity Trust Fund, that actually was created through a grant of the JEF in '96, administers now ARPA's financial resources. This is the timeline with ARPA. It was signed in 2002 by the Brazilian government, and it started in 2003. And then a fund, an endowment fund was created and attracted funding over time. And this is the trajectory of the area protected, reaching 50 or 60 million hectares over the years. And now a new mechanism to try to ensure the financial sustainability of the protected areas that have been created from ARPA was created in 2014, what's called the ARPA Transition Fund. It's a very interesting model because, you know, there is a rush to create protected areas as you can because the opportunity costs are still favorable, but over time it becomes less and less favorable. Politically, it becomes less and less viable. And now you need to protect and this patrimony that actually was created through a lot of effort and through a lot of financing that went behind it. But how do you ensure that this is going to stay into the future? And this was the idea of the Transition Fund. So the Transition Fund was capitalized. I think we have about, what, 235 million now, Meg? Or 215? 215. And the idea is that this is a sinking fund in which the government creates additional revenue. It can be from the line budget of the government or through other mechanisms such as compensation, environmental compensation funds. And this fund continues to finance protected area management, but over time, the share that goes from the fund decreases as the fund sinks in terms of financing, while the government finance or other sources increase. So there is a less dramatic way of internalizing the costs of maintaining these areas over time. This is just some self-compliments. We got the U.S. Treasury a few years ago gave the program its development impact honors from everything that the government has financed because the U.S. government was a supporter. And there have been several analyses and some quasi-experimental studies on the impact of ARPA in reducing deforestation. And the avoided emissions were equivalent to the total amount generated through the whole transport sector worldwide between 2005 to 2015. And ARPA achieved 100% of its target in 2017 with 117 protected areas and 60 million hectares. So it's quite a big accomplishment. And now that model is being exported to the neighboring countries in the Amazon, particularly Peru and Colombia. And that takes us to what we are doing now in the GEF on sustainable forest management, where this money comes from. And the idea here is to have a more holistic way of financing forest protection, not only through protected areas, but also looking at the larger landscape and looking at opportunities for economic development and looking for opportunities to have livelihoods that depend on standing forests as opposed to deforestation. 4 years ago, we jump-started what we call the Amazon Sustainable Landscapes Program, which brought together for the first time 3 countries in the basin that just happened to control 80% of the basin, Brazil, Peru, and Colombia. And if you follow Brazilian and South American geopolitics, you'd know that it's very, very difficult to bring countries together, particularly in frontiers that are very fluid, they're not very well controlled. There's a lot of paranoia about territory protection and all that. And this was the first time that 3 governments decided to come together and work on a joint vision for the region. Of course, the implementation of activities on the ground are determined by individual countries, but there is a commitment to working together into a joint vision for forest conservation through the years. So we approved with GEF financing close to $100 million for the next, starting was 2 years ago. For Brazil, it was $60 million. Colombia, 21. Peru, about 20. And Peru has 2 projects. One for a similar model as the ARPA in Brazil for a fund for protected areas into the future, and also $20 million for what's happening outside protected areas through the larger landscape. And then there is a regional component that's supposed to coordinate and bring some coherence across these different investments. These countries, they meet every 6 months to see how projects are faring. Actually, there's a meeting happening as we speak this week of all the countries in the region, and they are planning for the second phase of this program. So the idea here is that you can have capacity building that's regional in nature. It's not just the sum of the parts, but actually more than that. The Amazon is conserved under various regimes, ranging from strict protection all the way to indigenous lands and productive lands. The disciplining of agriculture, bringing back degraded lands into management. And, of course, a big piece on national policies and strategies, particularly for enforcement of existing legislation and development of new legislation. These are some of the, I'm not going to go through every single one of these boxes, but this is the 4 major components of this project: protected areas, the integrated landscape management, policy work, and capacity building. In Brazil, this project, again, has the same components. The ARPA program, the integrated landscape management outside protected areas, policies, and capacity building. Then 60 million hectares will be the focus of the program. In Colombia, more the same thing, with an emphasis on financial sustainability. Peru and Colombia are slightly lacking in terms of sustainability of the protected areas that they have created. Again, outside of protected areas, rural development under a low carbon emission pathway. Peru has 2 projects, as I mentioned, the sustainable landscapes side and the protected areas financial mechanism. So this is happening already. This is underway. And now we created a, let me just show this one. This is the proposed targets that we are expecting at the end of the investment in terms of areas affected. So it will be 82 million hectares of globally significant biodiversity protected, about 9 million hectares of sustainable land management in production, and the transition in terms of emission abatement of about 160 million tons of carbon. One other area that we have just began working on is this business of looking at commodities that have a significant footprint on tropical deforestation. They're basically soy, cattle, oil palm, and also pulp and cellulose. We're not dealing with pulp and cellulose. This paper came out a couple weeks ago that confirmed that about a quarter of all global forest loss in the tropics can be attributed to deforestation, primarily through these commodities. And we need then to really have a surgical way of dealing with them because they continue to have the largest footprint in deforestation globally. So we launched this program also as part of this to reduce deforestation in oil palm, soy, and beef supply chains. And the approach here with all these institutions that range from technical systems from UNDP, IFC does the work on the financing side of things. IDB and WWF are involved as well, particularly on the demand side. And this is taking a supply chain approach with support for sustainable production. We have work that generates a responsible demand. The transaction side, where's financing coming from to support agriculture and trying to clean the financial supply chain as well, and also an adaptive management component. So we are launching now the second phase of the Amazon Sustainable Landscapes Program. We have secured under the current budget $110 million for the next 4 years. There are additional countries that have now made expressions of interest to join the program. We have now Bolivia and Ecuador wanting to join in, and in addition to the 3 regional partners, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. So this is what we're going to be doing in this region for the next 4 years, in addition to the existing investments. So thank you.
A question for all the Brazilians we are just discussing here. Where this money goes to in Brazil about the Amazon sustainable landscape?
Yes, that's a good question. So the ARPA project goes through, we have Fumbio manages the money. And then you have, at the state level and local levels, regional nucleus of disbursement. It was decentralized, the funding, because initially it was all centralized in the Ministry of Environment, nothing was working well. And now the money is actually going to the end user, which of course the units that maintain the protected areas and so forth. On the, let's say, the landscape scale work, we have several local entities that deal with that. NGOs, Conservation International is part of this. UNDP does a lot of the technical assistance service. We have work on with the enemy, quote unquote, working with the agribusiness industry, with the Brazilian Rural Society on specific properties, model properties. So the money is distributed amongst agencies and executing partners on the ground. And it can be cooperatives, it can be, I can give you a map of how it's getting there. But you know, having said that, institutional capacity is low, as you know. So it doesn't move, money doesn't flow as quick as it should. And I was just mentioning to you before, and there's a huge amount of money that is dispersed from us to entities, and then it's somehow blocked because of lack of contractual agreements, because of lack of political agreement on the ground. We had one project actually that you may know about. Actually, Carlos Nobre was the one who, when he was at the Ministry of Science and Technology, jump-started actually on early warning systems in the Atlantic forest for not only early warning, but reforestation in areas of high probability of landslides. It was a project, it is a project with 3 state governments, Rio, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. The problem is that, you know, with the changes in government, you have to start the contractual agreement all over again. And this is the peril of actually working government to government. But this is the nature of this mechanism, is governments to governments. This is the institutional framework in which we operate. And this is all public funds. This is taxpayer money. So it's different from what we have with a private foundation that has more freedom to organize this. Yes?
Could you say a few words about the impact of ecotourism in the Amazon?
I probably would not be the right person to answer this, and we have experts here, and maybe Hita can let you know about. But you know, the potential for ecotourism is largely untapped. That's my honest answer. And I say this because we deal with ecotourism development in other parts of the world, Africa in particular, some places in Asia. The Amazon is difficult to reach in general. Infrastructure is poor. International tourism, with the exception of adventure tourism, do not like that kind of a institutional environment. American tourists don't like to be more than an hour away from a major airport. This is well established. This is well established. It's not. I'm not just saying this through studies. Europeans would be a bit more adventurous, but and it's also, it takes a different kind of tourist to appreciate a forest like the Amazon. It's not doing a safari in Africa. If you go and try to watch birds in the Amazon forest, you really have to be there for a while, and you have to be at the right time, and it's not, you know, wildlife rich. So the experience is a very different experience than what tourists of nature tourism is used to. Which isn't to say that it can't be done, because it has been done in a few model sites very well. Actually, I would say that of the countries that I know in the region, Peru has done the best set of experiences on this, and there's a lot to learn from that model. Yes, the lady back.
Hi, thank you. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about how do you go about local stakeholder engagement when you're creating these protection areas, especially considering that recently there has been a lot of criticism to traditional conservation models for excluding the local populations and disrupting their lifestyles?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is an ever-present issue when you're dealing with protected areas, so you have to do that. There are established protocols to consult with communities, to bring them into the discussion, to bring into the decision-making process. Actually, just talking about the GEF has very complicated institutional arrangements, but it does have some of the most progressive, I would say, policies when dealing with stakeholder engagement, gender guidelines, gender policies. And the proponents and the executors of these projects, they have to go through the motions and do the protocols and have to report back to us and how consultations are being done. So I wouldn't say that you know, there are some on occasion some tensions, because tensions are part of human societies. But overall, I think from my standpoint, the GEF has been the single largest funder of protected areas globally. I think, for the most part, things worked quite well. Yes?
So you mentioned some of the challenges that you've run into in Brazil. I imagine that Brazil is not the only place you're trying to save forests with economic incentives. So how does Brazil stand in terms of your other GEF programs, like in Indonesia or Africa? And if it's not as good, what's going better in those other places?
Yes. Actually, Brazil, I used to think that Brazil was difficult to work with when I worked in Brazil. And now I really like to work in Brazil because we have to provide financing for 165 countries every 4 years, whether we want it or not. Because that's the nature of being a financial mechanism to these conventions. And working in Mali, working in Myanmar, working in Timor-Leste is, you know, tremendously more challenging than a country like Brazil that has a lot of local capacity, have well-trained people, you know, for better or for worse, has institutions in place. So it's not that hard to work and to put good projects in motion. But I would say that we have very good experiences, for example, in South Africa. South Africa is probably one of the best users of international financing, particularly because, into the lady's first question, because they have a very, very well-developed participatory processes that they use to engage society at large. So they have, for instance, eliminated a lot of the invasive species in South Africa. You know, South Africa, particularly in the Cape region, is very rich in botanical biodiversity, but was all invaded by exotic trees. And the population was actually the one that was involved in the removal of these trees and all that ecosystem service that was provided, particularly for tourism, et cetera, was a societal outcome. And there are many others, but I would say that the difference between middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, like Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, you can work in these countries relatively easy. Then when you're talking about very, very poor countries, then the situation is much more complicated.
Thank you so very much. Couple of questions. One on one of the mechanisms that you identified, the auction for trades that are being undertaken. I, I'm I was curious to understand a little bit more. Are these some sort of reverse auctions, or is it forest related auctions, or is it actual emissions and
Well,
energy?
No,
You know.
these are essentially auctions that have to do with a land that has a particular tenure established. So if I'm providing you with a certain ecosystem service, in this case carbon, and that I have the right to either convert that or sell the carbon benefits. I can put that into the market. Can be, and then whatever mechanism can be a reverse auction. It can be, you can put a price, and then that's the limit you're gonna put it out. So there are different mechanisms that you can do that. But what I mentioned here is that this is not in place yet for most of the developing countries because there isn't a political agreement to that because there is a rift between how developing countries look at the climate change equation and what developed countries do. Developing countries don't like market mechanisms that much.
Yeah.
And therefore, what we can do as a financier of developing countries is relatively limited. So what I mentioned is primarily dealt with through modeling and through econometric models that show that this would be possible and actually could work. But it hasn't been put to the test on the ground yet, with the exception of developing countries. And what you have is essentially voluntary mechanisms. So the voluntary carbon market exists, and you can get money, but this is basically philanthropic and corporate social responsibility money that comes into that. You have a title, it's certified, but it's not readily marketable. The trading capacity of these certificates is limited.
I understand that there was actually a reverse auction in Sao Paulo to make payments to some subset of, I don't know, stakeholders, landowners for restoration, I think. I'm not entirely sure, so I was wondering if this was tied to that.
It could be related to forest code compliance,
Yeah.
which because the forest code allows for this kind of work to be done. So there's a very incipient market, and I would say it's still experimental to the extent that I can tell. But there are some mechanisms that are coming into place. I know, for example, of two new funds that came to existence over the past 2-3 years. One of them is called the End Green Fund. It's been capitalized over a couple $100 million. I know about that because we have provided some funding for technical services to bring individual projects to the bankable stage, and this fund wants to be active in the forest code market, in the legal reserve market in Brazil, and they're already looking at some deals in Mato Grosso, I believe, in which you provide funding, or you provide funding at the relatively low cost, highly concessional funding to landowners that still are not in compliance, and then you have 10 years of very subsidized rates to pay that back. So these things are coming into play.
So may I ask a question about the IFC project
Sure.
that you're partnering with IFC on? So is IFC putting in some investments to actually influence the supply chain? So it's not analytical work, but they are trying to somehow tighten the supply chain, so working with the corporates. How does that work?
So IFC in this particular case here is not necessarily investing directly. We're providing IFC with financing for them to train local banks into agriculture credit that is low carbon and that complies with local norms to avoid deforestation. So it's not that the lenders don't want to do that necessarily. Is that they don't have the protocols, they have no interest in developing them. But IFC provides not only that technical assistance, but it provides some de-risking capital that allows a local bank to take a little bit of risk in providing grants for areas that have this kind of compliance issue. And and become regularized, and so that's what they're doing. Okay. Thank you.
Well, me just, before we go to our last presentation by Rita Mesquita from Impa, a couple of items. All the presenters have agreed that we PDF their presentations and make them available to you at the announcement, the site there, so we will have it by tomorrow or the day after. Also, we have here Maria Fernanda Castro from the FAPESP news agency. She's a writer there. She will obviously write a report on this. We will, there will be a version of that in English that we will share with all of you. And so it's a way of, sharing this information, this very rich information that the presenters shared with us. With that, I would like to ask Rita Mesquita, senior researcher at Impa, the National Institute of Amazon Research, where that hosted a similar event like this, and I think it's a proper way of ending, this a series of efforts that started, I'd like to remind you, 4 years ago here at the Wilson Center, in terms of announcing all this effort that involved so many hundreds of researchers from Brazil, from the United States, even some from Europe, I believe, under the very able leadership of Professor Paulo Artacho. So, Rita, the floor is yours.
I'm here thinking that after spending a whole day really looking at the big picture, we're going to end this day with a more narrow, maybe on the ground work. But I think and I hope that what I have to say and present to you will help you maybe to see what we are trying to do there in terms of getting more substance to some of these big plans, because at the end, we really need to put it down on the ground and make it work right there. And I hope I can show you this is not a small challenge, it's a huge one. Also, from the onset, I think I'd like to say that even though I'm going to try, I put a selection of projects and results from Impa's community. Is not to say that we are all doing this in an integrated manner. And so for this reason, I also decided to include a few slides more as a provocation, so that we all think and reflect a little bit about what's at stake. Because I think there is still very big unknowns. And these are not unknowns because we don't know the results of the research. I think it's because we don't have the necessary institutional framework to make some of these projects and some of these plans really materialize the results that we hope, and that's why we do them. I'm going to have to learn to use this. Where do I point? This one? Okay, so I'm not going to miss the opportunity to talk a little bit about Impa because it's a chance that we have so that you get to know a little bit more of my institution. So Impa was created in 1952. So we've been 65 years on the ground there. And the mission is to generate and disseminate knowledge and technologies and to build capacity for the sustainable development of the Amazon. So, I think I'm going to be presenting a few results, but I decided to just give you from now the summary, because then if you have to leave, at least you know what we are up to. But I think really to put a value tag on all these little things, like I brought the manatees there, the training of people and the kids. Because at the end, we are talking about, it's funny because people are talking about transition funds. I'm thinking about transition generations. To think about this is like, what are we going to leave for the next generation is highly dependent on what we do now. And we don't have that much time, so we need to hurry up on putting our act together, sort of to say. But what we do most, and I highlight this as number one item, because everybody thinks about the research, but for the Amazon, training qualified professionals is highly important. One example to put this in context, the University of São Paulo alone has more PhDs than the whole Amazon, the whole Brazilian Amazon has. So that's what we're talking about. I mean, we are severely understaffed when it comes to building the knowledge bases that we need to manage in a responsible, intelligent manner that basin. Then, of course, influencing public policies is a key thing, even though we are learning, my generation is learning this the hard way, that is not the lack of knowledge that is missing for reasonable public policies. So sometimes it makes you wonder, how much more can we do before intelligent decisions, responsible decisions are made? So to influence public policies, we used to think, if we build the knowledge, it's going to be enough. But we're learning the hard way that sometimes not. Developing new products. I think this is important because every time we start talking about using Amazonian biodiversity, the next thing that we start doing is agriculture. It doesn't matter if you build soybeans, or acai palms. Every time we design a chain value that requires scale, the way to scale up so far has been conversion to agriculture. And that's something that we have to be very careful, because that's when we're really changing the system, okay? We worry a lot about soys and cattle, but it's not going to be any different if it's pirarucu in fish farms or acai palms in plantations. Technology transfer, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this soon, but it is a huge challenge for us because we are in a ecosystem, innovation ecosystem that is not very favorable. And then, of course, one important thing that Impa does is public outreach and environmental education. And in particularly where we are, this is very important. We have a small, like a forest garden, a botanical garden, associated with our institution. And we receive 150,000 people per year there. And 3 years ago, this place was considered the third destination in Brazil and the 7th in Latin America for tourism in contact with nature. So it's important for us, this role. I have to say 85% of the people that visit us are locals. They are families and school kids. And that's a very important thing for us. Impa has 65 different research groups, a community of 166 researchers. This is shrinking, but but it's there. And we are organized around 4 themes, research themes. And then you can look there, see how the distribution of research groups per themes. To me, it's a little worrisome that society, environment, and health has only 9 of our 65 research teams working on such important subjects, right? But that pretty much gives you an idea of the kinds of research that we do there. And a lot was told today about the challenges to develop the Amazon, thinking about the environmental services, thinking about the carbon cycle, the hydrological cycle. I would like to just go a little bit into taking the stand from the biodiversity point of view. So I think just to complement some of these ideas. Of course, all this goes hand in hand. It's just one added ingredient to the scenario that I would like to add. And this quest for sustainability, to me, is still a big question mark. And I think what we see from the research is a series of things. To begin with, thresholds that we cannot cross. I mean, I think it's piling up evidence of this. But we, personally, I worry about some of the models that we are using. And I already touched a little bit on this in the morning, because we getting these economic models, trying to make they talk with our environmental models, ecological models, and somehow the interconnections there are not very clear. So I think we need to put more work, more emphasis on these feedbacks. Unfortunately, I have to say, coming from there, the culture, most of the time, is more perceived as a barrier than an asset there. And this is something really critical, because we need to bridge the distance between traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge. And I feel like we still not doing a very good job at that. A lot of the social science, a lot of these studies are done from a very, like, the perspective of the culture as a subject, and not like to bring this body of knowledge that is so important to interact with local scientists. And I think this is an enormous asset that we have there that so far we haven't managed to completely incorporate into our development models. Innovation, try to do innovation in Brazil, and particularly try to do innovation in the Amazon. We are talking about an extremely unfavorable environment for innovation. It's unfavorable politically and institutionally. All kinds of barriers to advance. So there is room for innovation, there is capacity for innovation, but the environment for innovation is really very, very unfavorable, and it slows us down. It's easier to innovate elsewhere in the world. And that's probably the reason why so many of our researchers that deal with innovation are working abroad and don't go back because they don't find the necessary environment for them. And interdisciplinarity as a must, not a choice. I put it there because I think, and I just want to reflect a little bit, listening to Gustavo just now, I think it's really interesting that when we design so many of these major programs, we see a loci for it. We place it in a given ministry or in a given institutional arrangement, but we really need to build the platforms for interdisciplinarity to really happen at the decision-making level. Because we treat this interdisciplinarity as like the users of the programs and not the designers of the program, not the managers of the program. But I don't have suggestions. I just want to say that these are our challenges. Is how we're going to attain sustainability is going to be like that. And of course, I'm not going to talk about biosphere, atmosphere. We've had all the information, highly qualified. I just put this slide here just to remember that Impa is a key partner on all these things, and we have been developing capacity locally too for this, and these interactions, these international and institutional interactions are extremely important for us and help us design even our position in the region in terms of what we can do in terms of all those other important things. Our researchers are putting out for society and for decision makers very important results to inform public policies. And this is just a series of images to say that it goes from the impact of hydroelectric dams, of roads, modeling for future of protected areas, to like how the natural flooding system is affected by the hydroelectric areas. and then extreme events, climate change, and all this. But also, very, very common that we sit down around the table with local decision makers to come up with decisions on conservation. And this is just one example, is ecological corridors established in the city of Manaus. So Manaus has over 40 kilometers of creeks inside the urban area, and it has an endangered monkey species that only lives there. We have serious problems in terms of urban infrastructure and safety for people, for housing, because of living in inappropriate areas. So many times, Impa is the target institution to help come up with decisions, to analyze, and to propose alternatives to some of these major development plans in the town. Of course, the largest focus of our institution is biodiversity, inventories, and monitoring. This is not a minor task. 2 years ago, a team of our researchers spent 1 month in one mountain range in the Amazon, and they walk out of there with 95 new species to science. That's just 1 month. And we basically are doing this all the time. So the inventory, the biodiversity basis, is still highly incomplete. And we are continuously just putting one more little stone out there in the wall to have a good design. And of course, monitoring. We have some of the oldest monitoring sites of the Amazon, which are, because they are allowing us to see how the forest is responding to climate change on the ground with real data measured year after year after year. So it is very important that we maintain this infrastructure, because by no means the story is already understood, as I think my colleagues here already told us. And therefore, it's important that we maintain these monitoring protocols. Of course, some researchers are they kind of anxious for climate change, so they are already changing the climate in their laboratories. And that's just one example of one of our researchers that put together this really fancy, well-equipped laboratory that allows for manipulations of climate conditions and see how small species, mushrooms, fish, plants, insects, that are responding to that. So we also have this kind of facility to produce results for science, I think, to improve our predictions of biodiversity response. Impa always had a role in terms of studies with endangered species of the Amazon. So we have any number of groups there that deal with harpy eagles and manatees and endangered monkeys and endangered fish. And in general, it's like we end up doing a lot of these studies to predict and prevent extinction. And more recently, a lot of concern about the effect that climate change is going to have on some of these species that are sex ratios are determined by temperature, for instance. And we are starting to see already changes with turtles, with caimans, related to changes in the temperature. And some of our researchers are all doing these studies there. Chemistry of natural products. This is starting to get into the innovation part of it, but just to say that even like if we can manage to complete a chain, it doesn't mean that it's going to make it to the market. Because to develop it to become a juice in the shelves that we could buy, we would need a more interdisciplinary, a more different, not only the research, but the development of these products into place. And the environment for this kind of things to happen, for this kind of interactions and synergies, is not very favorable because the Brazilian legislation is so complex and so demanding on what you cannot do and very little on what you could do, actually. So it's like, it's very hard to overcome the barriers of the legislation on this particular ground. Impa has been instrumental in terms of bringing to light new food items from the Amazon, poorly known, highly nutritious, very high quality in protein, vitamins, food items from the Amazon. That one part of this is to like a rescue of knowledge that is little by little being eroded and lost because Amazonian people are becoming more and more urban. But what we also seen is that the human management of the forest really affected a lot of its distribution. So there is all this discussion now about what the so-called domestication of the Amazon. Personally, I don't like that term a lot, but I think it's very important that we recognize that there are areas in the Amazon that have been managed by human hand that influenced selection of species and species composition, and this is all very important. At the same time, there is a huge number of unknown important species. And just going to mention that mushroom right in the middle there. That mushroom is a cantarella, is a mushroom that in Japan, 1 kilo dry is about $1,000, but there you can harvest it in the forest floor of the white sand savanna areas, and it's really good. But we have one researcher that she started working with Yanomami Indians. She put together a book of more than 22 species of edible mushrooms regularly managed by these indigenous communities. Now, of course, once developed, this can become an important, significant market. But we're just starting to understand these types of things there. And then food security connects with this quite well. We have a lot of products that can make a huge difference on health and as food source for local communities there. Aquaculture is another one. We have over 3,000 species of fish, and God knows how many that we actually eat. Personally, I think we almost eat anyone that gets into the net. But but some are very important in terms of economic chains there. And we talk a lot about sustainable management of forest resources. What does it mean? We need to be very careful with the actual meaning of sustainable forest management, and some products probably more easily managed than others, but especially of concern is timber. I think timber is one of these products that we are harvesting 1,400-year-old trees there now, and we're not going to harvest these trees again. So how sustainable is that? It's something that open to debate. Smaller things like basically using resources that otherwise would go to waste, and this is just one of them, is a production of musical instruments out of Amazonian plants. A lot of technology associated with natural products, technology that could really be in the market already. Things important for construction, household, like finishing for walls, different materials for construction there, but nothing of this is in the market, okay? Nothing yet has the potential. Then, we think about bioprospection, and we think about this industry of the biodiversity. But even when you already is at that stage where you actually have a soap or a shampoo, it doesn't mean that this is that you're gonna be able to materialize that as a business, because of scale, because of the uncertainties related to production, because of the variability of the raw materials coming from the forest, because there is so many other factors to take into consideration until you really can stabilize a product like this and be confident that you can supply a market given the demands of the market. Huh? So I think I just mentioned there, one of the things that Impa has is a incubator, a business incubator. It's a small one, but is one of the few in the area there dedicated to biodiversity and biotechnology. As you probably heard, Manaus is an industrial city. It has over 600 industries. Those industries are all related to electronics. So it's a whole industrial basis put together to assemble cell phones and TV sets. Meanwhile, we have all this challenge with the biodiversity and with biotechnology, and no industries dealing with any of this. So I see this as an opportunity, as a chance to change the industrial basis of the city. But so far, it has not happened. One reason, maybe, has to do with the difficulty to go from this stage to actual industrialization. And a part of this challenge is because of the scale at which you can work the products. I'm about to close, but I just would like to say just one word of care, for lack of a better word to say, is that I think we need to be very careful when we think about developing some of these value chains based on Amazonian biodiversity, because there is no way we're going to be able to supply demands outside of the region, or if this is what we're going to do, it's going to be on a very small scale. We need to be careful with that, because sometimes I have this feeling that we raise this expectation that we're going to provide the world with Pt3, that everybody's going to have Pt3s, furniture made. It's not going to be like that. This is going to be extremely restricted and with lots of value added. And the value is going to come from studies like my colleagues showed earlier, which is attached to the environmental services of these forests, of the social systems that produce these raw materials or the processed ones, and on a scale that is very small. So I maybe not very small, but it's small enough to be sustainable. Because I think this scale is a key factor for this sustainability equation. And we look at the Amazon and we see this huge area, the size of the continental United States, but in reality, its biodiversity is distributed in very small pockets. And the challenges to bring it from all these different places are very large. So we should be designing smaller, more local, more focused projects that attach the production with the culture and recognize that as the product. So I think I'm going to stop there. But just to say that I'm just waiting to see if they're going to add one more name at the end of my ministry there, because it's just so many names. And these are my emails, so if anybody wants to have some questions, I'll be happy to answer to the best of my ability here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sam, and my question is about the transfer of knowledge from indigenous people groups to research, for example, your organization or other international organizations or organizations from Brazil, is there like any sort of formal mechanism for, being able to either catalog what's known already before it's lost or eroded away? And are these methods changing?
First of all, I think if you want to do research with the traditional knowledge of the indigenous people, there is a whole legal framework that you need to follow in order to do that. Like, you need to be able to explain to them ahead of time your objective. They need to agree on that. You need to make sure that you don't cross important cultural lines. You're going to have to be responsible for returning the results of your study to the communities that helped you there. So this is all in the legislation. I mean, this is something that you're going to have to do anyways. One question is about very critical knowledge that is protected in a way that you cannot even make it public. So in our institute, when situations like that happen, even the thesis defense of the students is not public, and the documents are not public, because they are restrained by the permits that granted how you're going to access and use that knowledge. So I think the legal framework is there, and is not different from anywhere else in the world, I think. But of course, we're talking about the formal research, right? That's not to say that the informal one doesn't happen, or that sometimes people approach communities without establishing clearly their objectives. That's a problem. When something like that happens, it's not the rule, and once detected, should be eliminated. I mean, that's not a good approach. So I don't know if I answered all your questions.
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. In terms of local capacity building, I was wondering if you could share a bit about your approach in terms of working with local communities to collect data for research, or perhaps to take part in monitoring and evaluating different development projects taking place that affect their communities.
There is a number of different approaches within the Institute because the community is so large. So one of the things, like, depending on your research, like if you're doing monitoring, and you regularly visit the same place, and you establish permanent monitoring plots that you go over and over. Now, in the Amazon, a number of such initiatives have flourished over the years, and basically you work together with the communities. So there is a level of capacity building that you do, but at the end, we need to evolve so that they not only they receive the results, but they take part on the interpretation, the analysis, and things like that. I've seen a few groups do it, but in general, the interaction stops at the level of the field work, the data collection, and then data that comes back pre-digested already. So we need to continue building this capacity so that in, I don't know, sometime, they will be the actual protagonists on this whole thing. We are starting to see some of this happen in some areas, particularly areas where some projects have been conducted for longer periods, because you already can see a generational transformation because of the involvement with research and also access to educational facilities, some of these things. But I think we are far from being what would be the desirable level, okay? You're welcome.
Ita, thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to touch on your last point about the businesses from the forest and the question of scale and the question of markets, right? And I say this because we started experimenting with some mechanisms to scale up businesses that don't have, by nature, that capacity. And what we found out was that, some of them cannot be scaled up for structural reasons, such as what you described, but they are probably still scalable to a certain extent, right? So, and they're probably too small at this stage to attract the capital that's needed to take the product to a different level, right? You may perhaps need resources to do some more R&D, to do the market preparation that you need, comply with regulations so that you can actually reach certain markets that you need to reach, phytosanitarian regulations and all that stuff that can present severe barriers to this. So what we've found out to be much more effective than trying to do this project by project is to create aggregation mechanisms that can attract capital that is seeking some return, but they're willing to take some risk, right? So if you aggregate some of this, it doesn't need to be aggregating acai with acai. It can be aggregating one product with another, such that you can have a business model in which the transport, is just shared.
Yeah.
The marketing is shared, and all that, and you can start attracting capital that doesn't have the patience nor the knowledge to determine whether, project by project, each one of these is profitable or not. So this might be one way of addressing that. And we found some interesting models that might be useful for you later.
This is great because some of the best success stories were exactly done on those grounds. That's why I call attention to this, because I think there is promise if we do that. So I totally agree with you. I mean, we've seen what happened in the Juruá Basin, for instance, through strong social organization and intelligent planning of transportation. They connected with all the different kinds of production, and we're able to take this to the market and are already starting to attract industries that are starting to get established in the municipality there. So I think there is a lot of potential there, and that's why I think we can attain scalable, products. But the design of this, in the absence of this social organization, is really hard. So that's why there is always a time lag. That time lag is what it takes to organize people if they are not already there. Of course, the other approach is look for where people are best organized and invest there, because you already have a favorable scenario to begin with. But for the whole basin, that's exactly what we need. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, with this, it's my turn now to thank a few people here. Obviously, Paulo Artacho, the colleagues from FAPESP, for this collaboration. I wanted to recognize my small but very efficient and gifted team here. Ania Prusa, our program associate, Lara Picanso, the program assistants, our wonderful interns, Brianna, I think Chris was here earlier, Truett from the environmental program, and I think April also, that is, but has interned with us. She is at SAIS, and I am particularly grateful for having this opportunity to host, to help to organize, facilitate. One important, I think, indication of the success of this from the Wilson Center point of view. We don't value quantity here. We value quality, the quality of the people that come and ask questions, and your questions were really testimony of that. Quality questions that you are informed people, you care about this. So, and we have about the same number of people, 6 hours after the beginning, the start of this, that we had, we have now the same number of people, or maybe more than we had in the morning. With that, on behalf of the Wilson Center, of the Brazil Institute, and my colleagues here, thank you very much, and keep checking our website. As I mentioned, all the presentations will be available there. You're always welcome here. Thank you.